Police officers laughed at the old car of a black woman, not realizing she was the wife of the district attorney. This day, which began with their mockery, marked the beginning of events that would shake the entire city. What happened next would surprise even those who thought they'd seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Police officers were laughing at the old car of a black woman, unaware she was the district attorney's wife. That day, which began with their taunts, marked the start of events that would shake the entire city. What happened next would surprise even those accustomed to the unexpected. But let's start from the beginning. Maria was driving home after a long day of teaching. It had been a full day, with her thoughts circling around her lessons, plans for the next day, and her family. Her old car trembled slightly at idle as she stopped near a supermarket in an upscale neighborhood, usually frequented by the well-to-do. Her aged Toyota, with rust and dents, stood out noticeably among the luxury cars around. As soon as Maria got out, she sensed stares directed her way. Initially, she ignored it, but then she heard muffled laughter nearby. Looking up, she saw two police officers by their patrol car. One of them, tall and large, laughed, gesturing toward her car, then smirked and walked over to her. The other officer followed, watching her with visible curiosity. "Hey, ma'am, aren't you afraid to drive such an ancient relic?" the first officer said mockingly, his voice loud. "If it even makes it home," the second officer chimed in, fueling his partner's joke. Maria pretended not to notice and headed toward the store entrance, but the officers assumed her silence was a sign of weakness and continued to provoke her. One of them, with a fake smile, blocked her path and subtly raised his hand, as if casually, yet firmly stopping her. "You really think this car should be allowed on the streets?" he asked, looking her directly in the eye. "You know, not many owners of these, let's say, classics can afford to maintain them properly. By the way, do you have your driver's license on you?" "Excuse me, what did you say?" Maria raised her eyebrows, trying to contain her irritation. "Your documents, please." The officer smiled dryly, his disdain barely concealed. "With cars like these, it doesn't hurt to double-check that you're legally driving, miss." Maria felt a wave of irritation rise inside. She had always shown respect to authorities, but such open contempt was humiliating. She pulled out her license and handed it to the officer, trying to stay calm. He scrutinized her ID and sighed theatrically. "Well, Maria, I'd recommend investing in a better vehicle," he said, returning her ID. "I don't know what brings you here, but you really stand out." Maria put her ID back in her bag silently, intending to move on. But then the second officer approached her car and began inspecting it loudly, tapping on the hood and peering inside with a smirk. "Maybe we should have it towed," he suggested to his partner with a wink. "It clearly doesn't belong here." Maria turned sharply, her patience reaching its limit. "This is just a parking lot, officers. I only stopped for a few minutes to get groceries." But the officers just laughed, one of them adding, "Oh, of course, we get it. It's just that cars like this aren't common here. Be careful, miss, and don't forget to fasten your seatbelt. You might need to make a quick getaway in your wonder car." Maria turned away, trying to hide her anger, and took out her phone. At that moment, she decided to call her husband, the district attorney. Maria was holding herself together, suppressing her anger and humiliation, but the rude taunts and condescending behavior of the officers were becoming unbearable. One of them leaned closer, a patronizing smile on his face, and quietly muttered, "Did you think you could just park here like it's your backyard? You know, this isn't your neighborhood." At that moment, Maria thought of all the struggles she'd endured to earn respect and achieve her position, of the countless times she'd had to prove her worth, despite stereotypes and prejudice. She held herself back, understanding that any response might only escalate the situation. Then she dialed her husband's number. Within seconds, Michael answered, his confident, steady voice instantly giving her strength. "Michael, there are 2 police officers here, acting unprofessionally, to put it mildly," she said, trying to control her emotions, though her voice still betrayed her tension. "I need you to come here." "On my way," Michael replied firmly. "Stay where you are. I'll be there soon." After she hung up, one of the officers, apparently intent on breaking her spirit, laughed and sneered. "Waiting for help from above? Maybe you're hoping a friend or daddy will cover for you." "Maybe her boyfriend's just a mechanic trying to fix up this wreck," the second officer chimed in, theatrically examining her old car. Maria stayed silent, refusing to be baited. She noticed a few passers-by starting to glance their way, hearing the officer's comments and noticing their mockery. One of the officers stepped closer, feigning politeness, and asked, "You know, since you're lingering, let's take another look at your documents. Everything's in order, I'm sure, but you know, rules are rules. Maybe this time I'll notice something new." Clenching her teeth, Maria took out her license again and handed it over. The officer examined it lazily, as if searching for something to nitpick. He handed her license back with a derisive sigh. "Well, Maria, I hope you can at least afford to pay for parking here. You know, the fines aren't cheap," he added with a sarcastic smile, making it clear he didn't think she belonged there. Suddenly, a black car pulled into the lot. Out stepped Michael Harris, a tall, imposing man with a determined look in his eyes. He quickly approached Maria and the two officers, who noticed his arrival. Annoyance flickered across their faces. They assumed he was just another bystander, unaware of who he really was. One of the officers called out, "And who's this guy?" lazily and dismissively, not realizing that this appearance would change their day entirely. Michael drew closer, his gaze steady, and without hesitation introduced himself. "Michael Harris, District Attorney. And yes, this is my wife." The officers paled, their arrogance disappearing in an instant. One of them tried to gather his thoughts, but the words caught in his throat. Michael's arrival had an immediate effect on the police officers. The smug expressions vanished from their faces as they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, visibly paler, took a small step back, struggling to think of something to say to justify his behavior. Sorry, sir," the first officer stammered. "We were just conducting a standard check. No infractions were found." Michael, his face calm but his anger barely contained, stared at them intently, fully aware of what had happened. His wife had been met with scorn and humiliation simply because of her appearance and the car she drove. Without a word, Michael took out his phone and began dialing the police precinct chief's number, keeping a steady gaze on the officers. "What are you doing?" the second officer muttered, sensing the situation slipping out of control. "I'm reporting what happened and your behavior," Michael said coldly, not breaking eye contact. "As district attorney, I have every right to demand explanations and initiate an investigation based on a complaint. My wife, a citizen of this country, was publicly humiliated due to your bias, and this is unacceptable." One of the officers, clearly shaken, tried to smooth things over and began apologizing. "Sir, we didn't mean any harm. It's just that her car looked suspicious and we—" "Suspicious?" Michael interrupted, gripping his phone tightly. "Or did you just decide that a black woman in an older car automatically makes her suspicious?" The officers had no answer, standing in silence with their heads down. People passing by had started to pause, noticing the scene and listening closely to every word. A few even pulled out their phones, recording the encounter. The silence was broken by the precinct chief answering Michael's call. Speaking firmly but controlled, Michael relayed the events, emphasizing that his wife had been subjected to insults and discrimination. He demanded that the officers be immediately suspended pending an investigation into their conduct. The chief, realizing the gravity of the situation, promised to address it urgently, apologizing once more. The officers, now facing Michael, understood that their careers were in serious jeopardy, and one of them finally whispered, "Sir, this was a misunderstanding. Please, forgive us." Michael's response was cold. "No, this is not a misunderstanding. This is an example of how certain people in uniform abuse their power. My wife doesn't need your apologies. She needs justice." With those words, he took Maria's hand, put an arm around her, and led her toward his car. Maria, who had held back her emotions all this time, felt a mixture of relief and pride in her husband. Meanwhile, footage of the incident, recorded by one of the bystanders, began circulating on social media, sparking outrage and discussions. By the next day, the video of the incident had gone viral. Social media was flooded with comments. People expressed outrage at the officer's behavior and voiced support for Maria and Michael. Such treatment of the district attorney's wife, especially in a public space, drew widespread attention, with the media quickly picking up the story and featuring it prominently, along with discussions about the issues of discrimination. The police precinct couldn't ignore the public response. Under the pressure of public scrutiny and media attention, the precinct released an official statement apologizing for the officer's conduct and promising a thorough internal investigation. Both officers were temporarily suspended from duty, pending a review of their adherence to ethical standards. Michael, understanding the importance of the moment, chose not to let the matter rest. He organized a press conference to bring attention to the systemic issue. Journalists, activists, and community members gathered for the event. Standing confidently at the podium, he addressed the crowd. "This case is not just about my wife being humiliated because of her appearance and skin color. It's about ensuring that no one has to face discrimination and bias from those who are supposed to protect our rights, not violate them." His speech left a strong impression on the audience. He cited other cases where African Americans had suffered injustice and called for reforms to improve police training and reinforce the protection of human rights. His words resonated widely, and the press conference quickly became a significant event, covered by local and national media. Meanwhile, at the precinct, both officers were called in for a hearing. They now understood that their actions had put not only their careers in jeopardy, but had also triggered a national scandal. The senior officer, who had initiated the taunting, attempted to defend himself, but public and internal pressures left him with no choice. He had to acknowledge his mistakes and issue a public apology. When his apology aired on television, Maria felt a blend of relief and pride that her story had catalyzed change. She understood that the fight against prejudice in society was far from over, but her case had become a small victory along the way. At a final community meeting, Michael, Maria, and their activist friends discussed plans for future actions. They resolved to support those who had suffered discrimination, assist individuals facing prejudice, and advocate for legislation focused on police reform and citizens' rights protection.